posit on how effective these are in actually reducing political and economic exposure for Asian investors? I know you've touched on it in your previous answer.
Asian investors are increasingly combining several layers of risk mitigation strategies in order to open up opportunities in countries that were formerly perceived as too high risk.
I'm Mahika Ravishankar, Deputy Editor at Trade Finance Global.
My name is Zainab Hussain. I'm a Senior Africa Analyst at Pangaea Risk.
Welcome to Trade Finance Talks, your go-to trade, treasury and payments podcast. Brought to you by Trade Finance Global.
Hello and welcome to Trade Finance Talks. I'm Mahika Ravishankar, Deputy Editor at Trade Finance Global, and I've been really looking forward to recording this episode, which focuses on Asian investment in Africa and how it's been catalysed by US protectionism. This year, we've gone back to the drawing board on supply chains and investment strategies, so it's been interesting to see an Africa-Asia landscape no longer dominated by the Chinese Belt and Road investment. Our guest today brings some fresh insights from Pangaea Risk's latest report, which reveals that Asia-Africa trade is now approaching $400 billion annually, transforming what was primarily an aid and resource extraction relationship into something far more sophisticated and strategic. So joining me is Zainab Hussain, Senior Africa Analyst at Pangaea Risk. Zainab, welcome to Trade Finance Talks.
Hi, Mahika. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast today. I'm excited to be here and discuss this important topic with you.
Good, likewise. So please just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background and your role within Pangaea Risk.
My name is Zainab Hussain. I'm a Senior Africa Analyst at Pangaea Risk. I lead our country risk forecasting for Southern and East Africa, where we rate the exposure of specific risk perils according to our proprietary risk methodology. So this includes political factors like instability and state contract alteration risk, as well as security and economic risks such as non-payment and currency inconvertibility.
Thank you. And to set some background, what do you say have been the biggest stimuli for Asian investment into Africa in recent years? And what weight do you place on US protectionism?
The surge in Asian investment into Africa has really been driven by two overlapping forces, I would say. So on the one hand, there's Africa's own fundamentals, which offer vast opportunities for investors. So Africa's economy is the fastest growing after Asia, and it has a rapidly growing population as well as vast mineral reserves. Then on the other hand, we've got the external push factors, like you mentioned. So there's US protectionism and also a wider trend of trade fragmentation between Asia and the US. This has accelerated Asia's pivot to Africa, high tariffs on Chinese and Indian goods, as well as decoupling pressures more broadly, I would say, have disrupted existing supply chains. So in response to this disruption, Asian countries and companies are deliberately seeking to diversify to Africa. So China, for example, offered a zero tariffs for all African imports. And although that still needs to be ironed out, that is perhaps a gesture in that sense. So I wouldn't say US protectionism has created the trend that we are seeing, but it has certainly been a catalyst that has accelerated Asia's pivot towards Africa.
No, and I agree with your comment on the zero tariffs from China on African imports being more of a symbolic gesture, particularly with tariffs being such a political tool used by the US, more as like a demonstrable symbol of a rerouting of supply chains and carving out a world without the US in it. Thank you. And I want to also talk about the different Asian economies and how their investment approaches to Africa differ. So you mentioned China, but also the report talks about Singaporean, Indian, Japanese, and South Korean approaches. What are the main differences between these approaches and what explains them?
The differences between these countries' approach to the investment strategies on the continent reflect both the country's comparative advantage, but then also its foreign policy style. So how it generally engages with international partners. So starting with China, mainly because it's still very much the largest player on the continent when it comes to talking Asia-Africa relations. So China's FDI stock, as we mentioned in the report, was recorded at about $42 billion in 2023. This is still very much infrastructure and construction focused. The focus for China has historically been interconnectivity and also resource extraction. Now, we've sort of seen a change under the Belt and Road Initiative where China is now moving from these mega projects to what is now called small and beautiful projects that are more bankable and also more modest in value. But I'm sure we'll discuss that later with touching on China on its own. With regards, as you mentioned, Singapore, the engagement with Singapore, or Singapore's engagement with the continent, is smaller in absolute terms compared to China. Its FDI stock was recorded at about $20 billion in 2023. But this is very much driven by the private sector. So we've got some consumer goods companies like Tolaram and Olam that are present in West Africa. Trafigura was involved in the Lobito Corridors operations. With Singapore's engagement, we see that Enterprise Singapore has played an active role in steering private firms to African markets and marketing Africa in a way with a large population and a youthful workforce that Asian companies can benefit from.
Sorry to touch on what you were saying earlier, an extremely fast growing population, so probably going to be a younger one as well.
Yes, definitely. The youth bulge in Africa is quite sizable. If I'm not mistaken, the median age is at about 20. There is massive potential for companies who are targeting the youth specifically with digital services and also just general consumer goods, right? Like the households need basic goods and then also food stuff. So Olam is a major player in West Africa and specifically in Nigeria, which has a massive population. And then pivoting to other countries like India and Japan specifically, I would say Japan has been generally rather traditionally more risk averse than other Asian players. And this is in general. So this speaks to not just on the African continent itself, but it's the way that these countries are engaging with the continent is generally speaking, how they engage with other continents as well. So with Japan, much of its FDI stock is actually in South Africa. And this is, of course, geared to automotive industry, which is where it has the comparative advantage. But we do see that Japan is more recently expanding into infrastructure, but it is still doing this in a more cooperation with the Africa Development Bank. So there's still that need for security.
Thank you very much. I'm curious about how the local population has responded to this, to suddenly the presence of big multinational corporations, as you mentioned, like Olam in Nigeria. Has there been a local response that you've observed?
Not necessarily any kind of negative sense. I think that these engagements are more slow burners. So it's not the mega projects that we've seen in the past where China comes in and builds a major railway or major highway. And then the country or the population is aware that this has been done through some kind of loan or some kind of debt that they are going to indirectly be paying for several decades on.
Because those I know have been met with some resistance, especially there are cases of these massive infrastructure investments actually harming the country's economy or environment. So this is much more of a, I guess, tactile deployment.
Yes, certainly, Micah. And that's exactly it. So in the past, these major infrastructure projects have been fiscally unsustainable. So a lot of the time, specifically through the Belt and Road Initiative, the loans are firstly denominated in US dollars, which are hard to come by for many African countries when there is a financial crisis. But then also, it doesn't generate the income or the revenue that it needs to immediately So the government ends up shouldering this debt burden. And then they do this by just taking on more debt or cutting expenditure on other social services. So we haven't seen this trend in this broader private sector led model that we see Asian investors deploying on the continent. So that's why there hasn't been much resistance, I would say. And the consumer goods is, if it's a product that is affordable for Africans and it's widely available, it is more welcomed than pushed away.
That's really interesting and especially leads on pretty neatly to my next question. How would you say the small and beautiful Belt and Road Initiative projects, branded by China, not my words, how are these impacting debt sustainability for African economies?
Like I mentioned, this is a major shift, and it's one of the
Yes.
most important ones that we are observing now in recent years. So these projects are more fiscally manageable, but at the same time, they are more aligned with the host country's priorities. And they are also often more environmentally sustainable as well. So they're often in renewable energy, or if they are transport, they are smaller scale. There's not these like major billion-dollar highways that the country then has to take out like a massive $5 billion loan just to build it. So these are more smaller projects, hence the small and beautiful that China has chosen to brand it as. So, for
Yeah.
example, it will be solar power developments that are led by Chinese firms. And these are more bankable and also less politically controversial, as you mentioned earlier, than the major projects of the past. So for African countries, this presents lower fiscal risk. And these projects can also be financed through a mix of private capital and concessional loans. So it doesn't have to be the case where the sovereign takes on all the borrowing itself. The risk can actually be spread and the responsibility can be spread as well. So that's what also helps with with it being more fiscally sustainable. And this reduces debt concerns, but at the same time, it also keeps the infrastructure development moving forward instead of locking out development at all.
Because I guess those massive, I want to say, overcommitments led to a lot of these white elephant projects where it's ostensibly a really great thing, but functionally maybe less so. So it's interesting to see that over a decade on, the Chinese have changed their investment approach in Africa and looks to be moving successfully. So that's great to hear. Africa's always been pretty resource rich. I guess during the scramble for Africa in the 19th century, European colonies were going after gold. Now the focus has shifted to critical minerals, the likes of nickel, cobalt, lithium, graphite. What does this mean for Asian investors in terms of the trade-off between immediate supply chain diversification needs and long-term sustainability ambitions? I mentioned the scramble for Africa because I know the way that gold and oil has been extracted in the past has been extremely detrimental to local economies.
I would say that the trade-off comes with sustainability, right? And for investors, and in this context, Asian investors, the sweet spot is then to meet these immediate supply chain needs while investing in the long-term sustainability through things like local beneficiation and local processing. So before, as you mentioned, there was this focus on extraction. I'm sure there were always some social responsibility on the side. It hasn't necessarily been the case where extraction comes with broader job creation beyond, for example, a specific mine or a specific construction project. It has almost just been a means to an end. And now what we are seeing to make this more sustainable, it's more about integrating a specific investment or a specific project into a broader ecosystem or a broader economy that Africans can participate in, and that makes it more sustainable. So as you mentioned, the critical minerals is a major focus, not only for Asia, but I would say for the entire world right now. And Africa is home to some of the largest reserves of minerals that are needed for industrialization and also for the global energy transition. While many countries are seeking to diversify their supply chains away from an over-reliance on China, they also need to realize, or the strategy is coming with a realization that in Africa, it cannot only focus on extraction as in the past. So we see that when investing in certain logistics corridors, for example, there's more of an effort now to spur economic activity along the corridor itself, instead of just extracting the mineral from the mine and taking it to the port, for example. So this is a very welcome change, and this speaks to longer term sustainability ambitions for investments, and also it lowers the political contentiousness and it sort of softens the narrative, resource nationalism, and it's kind of like welcomes the investment more rather.
Hey, enjoying the episode? Tap follow for more. Done? Let's get back to it.
Why do you think this change has come? Is it been an increased focus on the political narrative around it? Or has it been found that integrating investment into the broader ecosystem to spur economic activity is more financially rewarding in the long run than immediate extraction?
I would say that oftentimes when it comes to just focus on extraction, there is always that risk that there might come a new government, specifically a populist one, down the line that will now seek to change the terms of the agreement that the company has with the country. When it's too focused on extraction and the government is unable to prove its viability for the population, then it creates the sort of resentment among the population. And then when that government gets in power, they then seek to change those terms. Now, when it is contributing to something broader than just only that extraction, then it seems as a win-win for more people. And then it kind of, as I mentioned, like it softens that narrative of this extraction without beneficiation for the broader population itself. So I would say that it contributes to mitigating risks like nationalization and also expropriation down the line when the company is coupling its extraction with local beneficiation.
And since you mentioned risk mitigation, I want to talk about the multi-layered risk mitigation strategies that are mentioned in the report. Could you explain what this means and maybe posit on how effective these are in actually reducing political and economic exposure for Asian investors? I know you've touched on it in your previous answer.
Asian investors are increasingly combining several layers of risk mitigation strategies in order to open up opportunities in countries that were formerly perceived as too high risk. So I would put perhaps insurance as the first layer. What companies have now done is they've invested in a specific asset, and then this asset is covered by a specific insurance company, but then it's also reinsured. So it creates this double buffer almost. So, for example, in the Japanese company Sumitomo, for their stake in Safaricom Ethiopia, it's covered by Atiri, which is an African-based insurance company, but then it's reinsured by Nexi as well. This insurance is, I would say, the first layer. There's also MIGA, which is the World Bank's insurance arm that companies often use. And then export credit agencies like Sinosure, Korea Exim Bank, and also India Exim Bank are then another layer to then underwrite loans and projects. So you've got the insurance and then you've got the underwriting on top of that. But then there's also the option of setting up the project or the investment in a way where the finance that it is backed by is blended. Sometimes this can be a mix of concessional capital, for example, from like the African Development Bank or other multilateral institutions. And then this kind of also what this does is it spreads the risk from solely sovereign and like country-based risk, and to also concessional multilateral institutions as well. So they almost serve as like a buffer if the sovereign then gets into a circumstance where it's unable to pay. There are multiple ways that Asian investors are seeking to reduce this risk and enter into markets where before didn't see as worth it due to the high risk. And then, of course, there's also more traditional ways like forming local partnerships. And companies do this by creating joint ventures. And this is also like another way to enhance local beneficiation, especially if you form a joint venture with a local firm, so that local knowledge comes along with it, right? So it reduces market entry risk, and then also that job creation is quite local instead of just coming in as a foreign player. And then lastly, I would say, like on the legal side, what companies also do along with all of these, they'll essentially set up the company in a country that they have an existing, or that their country has an existing bilateral treaty with. So what we see many of these Asian countries doing, like India, for example, like companies from India, for example, and Singapore, is that they use Mauritius as like a base because they have a bilateral investment treaty with Mauritius. So then that serves as like a legal protection for their investment. So if they expand into Africa, they do it from their Mauritius arm. This adds legal protection because then if there is ever a dispute with the government that they are operating in, then they don't necessarily have to go for international arbitration. They can use the bilateral investment treaty as a base. So there are a number of ways. I mean, I wouldn't say that it completely eliminates political or market risk, but it does spread it. And it also, these strategies, by employing these strategies, it's enough to keep the capital flowing, to also create opportunities for investors to benefit from jurisdictions that would otherwise go untapped.
Thank you. It's really fascinating to me to consider how these bilateral treaties, like you mentioned, India and Mauritius, were shaped by colonial era. And I know a lot of Mauritian Creoles and slaves came from the French East Indian Company. So to see how those sort of 18th and 19th century dynamics are being completely rewritten in a modern age, used as a tool of economic partnership, is really fascinating to observe. So thank you for that. I want to talk about the shift from aid-driven to private sector-led investment, which is a theme that we've been talking about through this discussion. But do you consider that to be telling of a maturation of Asia-Africa economic relationships?
I would say is that definitely, firstly, what it also tells us is that with this maturation, the ties between Asia and Africa are becoming more commercial and also more balanced, right? So with the private sector involvement, it's not sovereign, it's not dominated by sovereign to sovereign anymore. It's becoming more diverse. So in the past also, Africa's relationships with many global powers was framed around aid and concessional loans, and sometimes perhaps more controversially on infrastructure for resource swaps, like what we saw in the DRC. Today, more recently, private companies are increasingly taking up space. So whether it's Olam in Singapore or Tata from India or Toyota from Japan. I know Toyota's been around here for a while, but the former two are more in their expansion phase very much. So we see these private sector players taking up more space and perhaps taking some burden away from the governments to sort of run this or keep these ties. What I think this really reflects is a shift in Africa's own needs. Governments now want investment that creates jobs and that builds industries as well, right? And not only just industries, but industries that can then integrate into global supply chains. They no longer sort of like 100% benefit in just an aid dependency, because that's more short term. There's more this long-term view now. That's on the Africa side. And then on the Asian side, what I've been observing is that they want commercially viable projects, right? ones that will deliver returns, but also ones that will fit into their ambitions when it comes to the global energy transition and when it comes to their own sustainability goals. So with Africa contributing such a small portion of global emissions, there's then an opportunity for Asian investors to now almost expand into Africa's markets where there's less environmental sustainability risks, I would say, and there's an opportunity to contribute to more environmental sustainability and to actually resolve some of the challenges that Africa faces due to climate change. But at the same time, it's commercially viable because with the growing population, something like solar power projects will enhance access to electricity for a growing population. So electricity will always be needed, digital services as well, contributing to larger access to internet connectivity and things like that. It can serve both the sustainability question as well as the commercial viability question.
Thank you so much. This has been a really, really fascinating discussion. And I want to finish off by building on the last point about this population growth, which you mentioned right at the very start, that Africa's fast growing population, coupled with trade fragmentation caused by the US, is what's acting as a stimulus for this increased recent Asian investment into Africa. You spoke about utilities and internet and digital connectivity as markets which are going to play a greater role to serve this population, which is set to increase to 2.5 billion by 2050. I considered this demographic shift to also lead to a focus on consumer markets in terms of investment. Would you agree with that? And where do you see Asian investment in Africa moving in the next 25 years?
Oh, yes, absolutely, Maika. So firstly, demographics is one of Africa's biggest competitive advantages. And as you mentioned, a doubling population, but also rapid urbanization doesn't only just mean workers, it also means consumers. This consumer market strategies will become increasingly important for investors that are seeking to expand in Africa. So we do see already that Asian firms are pivoting in that direction. And I think we've mentioned it a couple of times on this podcast already, like Olam, for example. They already have a foot in the door in West Africa when it comes to food supply chains. Then there are also Indian companies like Tata, which I also mentioned, that are producing vehicles for African consumers.
I know you're based in Cape Town, Zainab. Have you seen the effects of this on day-to-day life? Are you seeing these brands growing more commonplace?
I was actually just about to mention, like, for example, countries like South Korea, that's generally more industry type focus. Like now we see that our grocery stores now have Korean noodles. Just like a couple of blocks away from me, we've got a Korean store where they sell all kinds of things like the soft drinks, Korean noodles. They even sell ice in a cup, like all the things that I would say like the younger generation are observing on social media and have now created a demand for. The Korean companies are seeing this gap and are seeing that there are markets in African countries where they are aware of Korean products and there is a market to sell to. And it's actually quite remarkable how it's taken off. There's also now Korean restaurants as well, which we didn't have, I would say, 8 years ago. It's largely because there's this growing younger population specifically, that are more digitally connected than before. So they see all kinds of foods and all kinds of things. And now for us, like Asian food or the idea of Asian food has just expanded. And then, of course, as we've touched on earlier, there's also opportunities in digital sectors as well, which Japan has now pivoted from mainly focusing on vehicles to now taking up a stake in Safaricom Ethiopia. Demographics will definitely shift the balance, and I believe it has started already. So while resource and infrastructure projects will remain important, of course, and interconnectivity when it comes to smaller scale infrastructure projects will remain key. I wouldn't say that they would fall away. The longer term strategy or the longer term benefit would be in focusing on consumer markets. And this is where Asian investors can really leverage scale and also leverage affordability to meet Africa's needs.
Thank you very much, Zainab. I think to me, the big takeaway is the benefits could lie really in this investment, in the fusion between African and Asian cuisines. Like if we were to see some sort of jollof rice sushi, that would be incredible. Definitely a great outcome of this investment. Zainab, thank you so much for this discussion. It has been really a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show, and your engaging questions were most welcome.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.